Great. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and welcome everybody to our event today, Creating Our Paths, Women in Power. My name is Nancy Yap. I'm the Executive Director of CAUSE. Thank you for joining us today. We're recording this event and we'll make it available to the public afterwards. This webinar also has English subtitles and live transcript options on the bottom of your Zoom tool. Creating Our Paths is part of the CAUSE Leadership Institute, a leadership and advocacy training program for experienced professionals with a passion for serving the Asian and Pacific Islander community. Tonight's program will include interviews with Congresswoman Judy Chu, Senior Vice President for Edison International in Southern California Edison, Caroline Choi, and Michigan State Senator Stephanie Chang, interviewed by Diana Hwang, of the Executive Director of the Asian American Women's Political Institute. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the CAUSE sponsors. We're going to have them up on our PowerPoint slides. First, our CAUSE Leadership Institute sponsors, the Centene Foundation, Edison International, and the Southern California Gas Company, as well as our general support sponsors, who also include the JT Thai Foundation, Charlie Wu, East West Bank, and Southwest Airlines, and also our CAUSE vote initiative. Sorry, a little bit out of order of our screen, but definitely thank you to all of our sponsors for supporting our work, both in civic leadership training as well as in vote initiatives. I'd like to introduce our first guest, Congresswoman Judy Chu. The Honorable Judy Chu was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in July 2009, the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history. She represents the 27th Congressional District, which includes Pasadena and the West San Gabriel Valley of Southern California. She's been a visible leader in our community for years and a meaningful advocate for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout her career. Please welcome the Honorable Judy Chu.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me as part of the Women in Power event. I certainly appreciate your Executive Director, Nancy Yap, and CAUSE for hosting today's event. As the first Chinese American woman ever elected to Congress, I know firsthand the unique barriers that Asian American and Pacific Islander women face breaking into politics. And that's why events like this and the work that CAUSE does is so close to my heart. This is such an exciting opportunity for AAPI women to come together, share stories, and to support one another. And talking about stories, let me tell you how I got to be in this position. I actually never thought that I would be an elected official, let alone a Congress member, because I did not see people like me in these positions in my days. In the city of Monterey Park, however, change was occurring because immigrants were moving in and an anti-immigrant backlash occurred. There was a loud group of longtime residents that resented the new immigrants. They wanted English only on the signs in the city and only English books in the library. The last straw was when there was a resolution passed by the city council saying that only English should be spoken in the city. Well, when the English only resolution passed, people said enough is enough. And in fact, I joined a multi-ethnic coalition to fight this resolution. Together, we gathered thousands of signatures on petitions. The pressure was enough to get the resolution overturned. But it became apparent that the makeup of the city council did not reflect the people who lived in it. So I ran for the city council to be a new voice, a voice that would work to bring the community together. I won that election and spent the next 13 years on the council working to build a more inclusive city, including serving as mayor 3 times. Then a vacancy occurred for the state assembly seat in my district. But when I decided to run, I was quickly blocked by the Old Boys Network. You see, the establishment chose their male candidate. Because of their powerful backing, the Speaker of the Assembly at that time did not support me either. Things looked bleak. But then there was a turning point in my campaign, and I remember it well. It was the moment that a mentor came to help me. It was when then Congresswoman Hilda Solis decided to support me. You see, when she ran for Congress, she had gone against the establishment herself. She ran against an entrenched longtime male incumbent, and she faced many naysayers in her campaign. But she persevered. And in one of the most memorable campaigns in Los Angeles history, she won. She never forgot what it took to win. And when she supported me, it turned everything around and I won the state assembly seat. Then 8 years later, an unexpected thing happened. President Obama made the lightning bolt of an announcement that he was selecting Hilda Solis as the Secretary of Labor. It opened up the congressional seat. I ran for it, and on July 14th, 2009, I won. What was even more amazing was the next day when President Obama called me from the White House to congratulate me on becoming the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history. What did I learn from this experience? Well, for one thing, find a mentor, somebody who believes in you and will help you. I found one with Hilda Solis, and it made all the difference in the world. And by making these connections here in cause, you're already on the path. The other element that I would say to getting in this position that I would advise you is to get the skills that you need to become a leader. Those skills are to speak, to network, to lead meetings. I mean, you never know when the opportunity will present itself to make that move up. I didn't know that the congressional seat was going to open up, but I tell you, by the time it did, I was ready. There were barriers that I did face, and so many of the barriers that I did face are still present. But AAPI women have made so much progress, and my hope is that the path forward for all of you is easier. 35 years ago, when I was just getting my start in politics, only 24 women served in Congress, and that's counting both the House and the Senate. Thankfully, so much has changed since then because we've come together, we've organized, and we've broken down so many barriers. Events like this one and organizations like Cause are a huge part of that because now there's an infrastructure for AAPI women. And I am so happy to say that today I am one of the 149 women serving in the 117th Congress. Not only that, we actually have the most diverse Congress and executive branch in history now. As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAT, I'm especially of those members are AAPI women. And like me, so many of our KPAT women elected to the House of Representatives. Grace Meng, the first Asian American ever elected from New York, and two Asian American women in the US Senate, Mazie Hirono and Tammy Duckworth. And of course, something stupendous is that we have Kamala Harris, the first AAPI Black and woman vice president of the United States. And Vice President Harris isn't the only high-profile AAPI serving in the Biden administration. We have Ambassador Catherine Tai as the United States Trade Representative, Deputy Secretary of Labor Julie Su, Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget Nani Coloretti, and Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta, just to name a few. In fact, 12% of all President Biden's nominees to Senate confirmed positions identify as AAPI. And outside of Washington, D.C., we have trailblazing leaders like Michelle Wu, the first Asian American to serve as the mayor of Boston. The thing that I'm proudest of with being in my position is that I can show that Asian American women can be good leaders for all Americans. Never was this more evident than just a couple of weeks ago when there was a leaked document that 5 Supreme Court justices would overturn Roe versus Wade. It was as though a bomb was dropped when women realized that their rights could be set back 50 years. Well, I have been the leader of the effort to enshrine Roe versus Wade as the law of the land with my bill, the Women's Health Protection Act. I did get it passed out of the House, and in fact, it was the most supported abortion rights bill that's ever passed out of Congress in history. It is so gratifying to know that women all across America can see that an Asian American woman can be a strong leader to defend their rights to equality and justice. But the most important element to all of this is all of you actively thinking about how you can get involved and how you can make a difference. Of course, one of the most important elements is making sure that we encourage our population, our AAPIs, to vote. When you vote, you have a chance to choose elected officials who you trust to make policy decisions that are in your best interest and that align with your values. It's an incredibly powerful choice and so important when after so many years of being invisible, our votes are starting to count and our voices are finally being heard. And that means that we have a chance to address problems that have been impacting our communities for years. In my time in Congress, I've seen so many pieces of legislation pass or fail because of one member's vote. If you want to have a say in how we address anti-Asian hate, for instance, or the price of housing, or how we support families, voting is the single most powerful thing you can do. For example, last year, members of Congress came together to pass the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which addresses the rising anti-Asian hate in our country. The bill was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, but it was possible because members had heard from their constituents, especially their AAPI constituents, that combating anti-Asian hate was a priority for them. And so it was a moment when the voice and power of AAPI voters came in loud and clear. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is to get further involved in politics by supporting candidates or running for office yourself. We need more AANHPI women in politics, and you could be the person who makes the difference. And you can learn how to be in politics and how to be a leader, because now there are so many programs that are building the pipeline of leadership, with Cause being one outstanding example. But just yesterday, I was at the Asian Pacific American Institute Fellowship Program in Washington, D.C. that also does that. That, by the way, was started by Congressmember Norm Mineta 20 years ago because he felt it was so important to build that pipeline. And I was so impressed by the young AAPIs that have come out in the 20 years since, learning about and navigating through government and learning how to be leaders. We are already seeing the benefits of the fruits of our labors in building that pipeline as they take leadership positions. Well, we need your leadership because we have still so much work to do to achieve equitable representation, and there are still so many more barriers to break. So I encourage all of you to use the lessons you learned through Cause, not only to empower yourself, but to uplift other AAPI women around you. Thank you all for being here, and I wish you all a very happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Chu, and for all of those words and reminders of also just how many women firsts that we've seen in this last few years, and just also that there's support for folks who are interested in being more engaged and in running for office. I want to take this moment to invite any of the fellows from our Leadership Institute program to ask any questions by raising their hands. And then they can go ahead and turn on their camera. Is there anyone who has a question for the Congresswoman? Benjamin, go ahead and turn on your camera and go ahead and ask your question.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming here today. I'm actually a constituent in the city of San Gabriel. I wanted to ask, what are some of the biggest barriers that you faced when it comes to organizing and trying to mobilize the AAPI community?
So 70% of our population is comprised of immigrants. That actually is far higher a percentage than for Latinos or for their other populations. So what that means is that we have many in our communities that are new to this system, that are new to things like the conventions of voting or how to vote. We also have a high degree of people that are limited English proficient. 1/3 of our population is. So what that also means is that we need to ensure that materials that are essential for them are translated, including voting materials. So the one most important barrier is making sure that our population really understands how important voting is, but then also that they understand how to participate, that they understand how to vote by mail, and that they also understand what the issues are, which means that language translation is so necessary. And once we do that, we unlock an incredible power. Now, we've made some progress over time. And I was so proud in the 2020 election because there were many of our AAPI organizations that went to the battleground states like Georgia and Pennsylvania. But Georgia is a very good example where they went there and they have a increasing population that had not participated in politics before. And in fact, they have 30,000 new voters in Georgia, but our AAPI organizations went and mobilized them in the way that I was talking about, the one-to-one interaction, explaining everything and so forth. And as a result, AAPIs became the margin of victory in Georgia. In fact, AAPIs had a 300% greater turnout than in the previous year. And AAPIs were, I believe, they were 12% of the vote. But look, Biden won that state by a very small margin. And actually, what followed soon thereafter is the Senate races of Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock. And that was also by a small margin too. So you get AAPIs to really mobilize their voices through the vote, and look what a difference you can make. Certainly those AAPIs in Georgia made a difference in the whole shape of this country, actually.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
for
Congresswoman.
that. I see Anthony has a question as well. Go ahead, Anthony.
Thanks, Nancy. Hi, Congresswoman. Anthony, I actually used to work for Congressman Scott Peters here in San Diego, so nice to see you here. Just some questions for you right now. What issue frustrates you the most in terms of what's happening in Congress? And then what is your visions and goals for having more women in higher offices, and especially women of color?
Well, I think you're catching me at a time when I'm thinking about the fact that we have not been able to curb the sale of guns in this country. I mean, how many more deaths will it take? Of course, the AAPI community has been terribly harmed by this too, because it was only a year ago when a shooter bought the gun the same day, didn't even have to wait for any kind of background check, went to an Asian spa where he knew there would be Asian women, traveled 27 miles to 2 more Asian spas, where he, of course, also knew there would be Asian women, and shot inside of all those spas, killing 8 people, with 6 of them being Asian women. And now we just have mass shooting after mass shooting. What happened in Buffalo actually gave me flashbacks, because that 18-year-old went and targeted that supermarket because there were Blacks in there. And so he did the same thing. He drove 200 miles to go and just shoot Black people. But yesterday's shooting was beyond compare. For this boy to legally purchase an assault weapon and kill 19 kids and 2 teachers are beyond my imagination. It has to stop. But I have to tell you, we've been fighting this, and this is why I'm so frustrated, because we have been fighting this now for years. We actually first started introducing the bipartisan universal background check 7 years ago. And we actually were able to get it out of the House in this last Congress. So it is actually sitting over there on the Senate side, and 50 of the, well, I would say maybe a majority of the Democrats, or majority of the Senate, I should say, support it, but they can't get the 10 Republican senators to join in to break the filibuster. So we need to put pressure on them, because there are obvious things that we can do to stop this gun violence. There are obvious things we can do to get guns out of the hands of the wrong people. Why should it be so easy for this 18-year-old who killed those 19 children to get a gun when that same 18-year-old could not buy beer? It's easier to buy a gun, a semi-automatic gun, than beer in this country. That's wrong. It's so upside down, and there is so many common sense laws that we have been pushing that we actually got out of the House. It is now in the hands of the Senate. It is so frustrating because people's lives are being ruined in this country, and now these mass murders are happening nearly every day.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, and just hearing the passion you have for it and your continued work, but also reminding us that we can do something too, and really also continue to pressure our elected officials, and just voice what we want as well, which is also to see the violence stop. So thank you for sharing. If you have time for one more question, we can ask one more question. And in the meantime, everyone can prepare for the photo that will follow the question. So Justin, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Congressman Chu. I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, and my family still lives there. So I truly respect and appreciate all the strides you made for our community. My question is, do Asian Americans from both parties work together on AAPI issues typically? For example, do you see like young Kim and Michelle Steele work with the Asian American caucus and vice versa? And if not, how do you imagine we can help bridge this gap so that both parties can work together towards the common goal of helping out AAPIs?
Well, I believe we can work together on things like ensuring that Colonel Young Kim gets a congressional gold medal. I mean, there are certain things that we believe are important, and that is upholding the images of Asian Americans. So thankfully there is that. But I can tell you that in Congress, things are very partisan. And so, for example, the Georgia spa shootings, we would, those on the Democratic side would condemn it and say that therefore there should be measures like a waiting period so that young man could not have gotten that gun to shoot those 8 people, including 6 Asian women. We would we definitely part ways there. So, that part is partisan. I do have to say though, that in the community, it's a totally different story. in the community, when people when I'm talking, I have so many people in the community who are Republicans, so many who are independents, and they just want to make sure that we have a good quality of life. If we can work together on our ultimate goal, which is, I mean, I believe it should be making sure that our democracy is upheld and that everybody can vote and that we can break down the barriers to voting, such as by having no excuse mail-in ballots, that there are drop boxes and things like that. I think most Americans agree, regardless of their party. Actually, did you know that most Americans agree that there should be universal background checks? You know, most Americans do not think that this gun violence is right. They want it to end. And so, and so that's where we have to go towards. We have to get the majority of the American people to pressure their representatives to do the right thing. And that's where the change will happen.
Thank you so much, Congressman Chu.
Thank you. And thank you for even sharing that story about how you interact with folks who may be on a different party side, but still want that quality of life in our communities. I think that's meaningful and part of the reason many of us want to be involved in our local government. And so thank you for sharing that story. But I'd like to now invite Caroline Choi to turn on your camera. Great. Caroline Choi is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Southern California Edison and its parent company, Edison International. She oversees corporate communications, corporate philanthropy, government relations, and public affairs at the national, state, and local levels. She also serves on a number of nonprofit boards, some focused on both clean energy and electric transportation. She's a leader in corporate, nonprofit, and government spaces. Please welcome Caroline. Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. So glad to be here. And yeah, thanks to Cause for having this event, and happy Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
Thanks. Yeah, no, we were excited that both this Women Empowerment as well as we could make it part of this Cause Leadership Institute, which is virtual again this year. But they've been talking a lot about different ways to be civically engaged. And so it was really perfect to have you here because you've had experiences in so many different sectors and have a very different career path that I think really matches what is possible in terms of working in government affairs. So I thought we'd start with what was that moment you realized that you wanted to work in government affairs? And could you also then share about how your role collaborates with policymakers?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm not going to say that it was a moment. When I was named the head of corporate affairs in 2019 at Edison International, it was like coming full circle because my first job, my first real job out of college was in government, where I was working on the Hill for the person who represented my hometown in North Carolina. And so I felt like it was one of the best jobs, still think it's one of the best jobs I ever had. And for those of you who have been staffers, you know, it's fast paced, a lot of information coming my way, helping constituents in the district, getting exposure to issues that I never even heard of before I became a staffer. It was also the first job where, you know, I was calling men and women that were older than me by the first names instead of ma'am or sir or Mr., Mrs., Miss, whatever. So that took some getting used to. And it's really where I understood how important using our voice can be in making an impact. And so what's key, I think, in government affairs is making the connections between people and the opportunities to solve issues, to advocate for change, policies that make people's lives better. And in my current role at Edison, I get to lead a team that's full of government affairs, public affairs, communications, and philanthropy professionals. And so at Edison, you know, probably our biggest focus, and we talk a lot about it, is helping to create that just, equitable, clean energy economy for 2030 and 2045. And it absolutely supports the business that I'm in, but it also helps to support the state in its goals for climate change and for clean air and for the type of economy that it wants to move towards as we think about the future and the planet. And so the folks that I work with at Edison, when we talk about collaborating with policymakers, it's really how our business interests align with the government priorities. And in this case, I think there's great alignment in terms of the priorities that we have in terms of helping, like I said, to create that just, equitable, clean energy economy and where the state is headed, because we recognize that clean energy, which we procure a lot of and deliver to our customers, is what the state wants. And electrification, whether that is transportation or buildings, also aligns with where the state is headed in terms of that carbon neutral economy in 2045, because electrification, that whole pathway of clean energy and electrification, is the least cost way of achieving what the state wants to achieve. So it's great that our business strategy aligns with the state strategy, and that's just a benefit. There's all those times when sometimes we don't have alignment and we have to work through where, even though we have differences, what are the places where we can align and work through and at least come to some common understanding in certain areas, even though we may not agree on all aspects of an issue. And so just as Congresswoman Chang talked about having compromise in legislation, we do the same, not just with policymakers, but with the stakeholders. And many of you work for companies, and you all know how it is to all have your voices going into, whether that's Sacramento or Washington, D.C., or at the local level. And rarely is there unanimity in a position, but it is working with like-minded parties, bringing other voices that help to put together a coalition, whether it's a loose coalition or a formal coalition, that helps make sure that we amplify the voices, and particularly our voices of the communities that are often underrepresented in Southern California, and bring that forward. You know, one of the things, we had a meeting not too long ago with Senator Padilla, and I was telling him how glad I was that he represent, you know, that yes, he represents the state, but that he comes from Southern California. And because so many of our statewide leaders actually come from Northern California, as you know. And he mentioned, I had no idea, but he said, you know, when I started in politics, when I was in the city of LA, and if you were to draw a line across the state that divided the population of the state from north to south, where, you know, do you know where that line was? And we were all guessing where the line was. And he said that the line was in the San Fernando Valley. And he said, do you know where the line is now? And no, you didn't know. And he said, the line is now through downtown LA. So it just shows you how much of the population in the state of California is down here in Southern California, and the importance of using our voices to really make sure that the policymakers that are in Sacramento, and particularly the agency heads and the folks that are in the commissions and things like that, that are being appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate, that they understand the challenges that we have in Southern California, how different they are from Northern California, the population, the diversity, the roads, all these different things that make Southern California unique, that are leveraging those voices to policymakers, and making sure that that is being heard too, because oftentimes I think we see policy that doesn't reflect necessarily the challenges and the opportunities that we have in Southern California. So it's one of my favorite things. I had no idea that so much of the population, just really, you can see that it's not a whole lot of the population, not as much of the state after you draw a line east to west in downtown LA, but that just shows you how many people are down here. And if we can put our collective voices forward, the opportunities that we have.
No, yeah, and it's so great to hear you just talk about like how your role in this company is also a role that is inclusive of thinking about communities and voice and what it looks like to really have an impact there too. So it's some of what I was hearing in the way you were talking about it. And I think just wanted to get a little bit more of a sense of what you feel like the key elements were for you to get to this place. Like what were some of the things you learned from others, and what were some things that you know are unique to you and were part of the way that you were able to create this path?
Yeah, so I did not start with an ambition to be in government affairs. Let me just be clear. I was a government major in college, but that was sort of the extent of it. I don't think I was actually really, again, still planning for a government job or government affairs. I think I was thinking, oh, I'll go to law school and become a lawyer. But I grew up in a small town in North Carolina. It was a very small town. We were the only Asian family, so very different than Southern California, where we have a huge Asian population, a lot of diversity across many races and ethnicities. But I would say my parents really pushed me and my siblings to think beyond just this little town where we live, that it wasn't representative of the bigger world for certain. And one key element then for me in creating my path was my parents and exposing me to the broader world and to push for results. I'm sure I'm not the only one whose parents were asking about good grades in school, but not just grades. It's also being engaged in the community, whether it was Girl Scouts when I was younger or volunteering in the community when I was older. And so just having a sense of responsibility beyond just thinking about myself. When I graduated from college with my government degree, the economy was in a really downturn. And so I graduated without a job, as did many of my colleagues or classmates. And so I was actually working at the college for a professor when I landed my job in Washington, D.C. as a Hill staffer. And that was really due to my godfather, who was a state legislator and who knew the congressman who had just been elected. And so was building up his staff, and so I started as an intern, right? And $12,500 a year. Oh my God, I was so poor. And became from an intern to legislative correspondent to legislative assistant to legislative director. Became an appropriations staffer. He got named to the appropriations committee. And one of the things that the appropriations committee members did for themselves is to have two staffers that they got funded by the committee versus their their staff budget. And so they actually ended up having more staff than a typical member may have. And I would say a key element there for me and just having the development on the Hill was being a workhorse. I mean, I think it's my nature. I am a workhorse, but it's also really essential when you are a staffer. I know many of you who have been staffers understand that. There's always a ton of work to do. There's never enough people to do it. It's truly many times a 24/7 business because bills have this certain period of time when the session's in, and so you can be working very late at night and early mornings. And so whether that was crafting a letter or printing form responses or stuffing envelopes, taking phone calls, driving the congressman, I mean, I would do any of that. So just, I think, showing your willingness to work and doing really high quality work, whatever it is another great way to move ahead. And it certainly helped me in my career. When I shifted to the private sector, because I left the Hill and moved to the private sector and was a lobbyist, it was definitely different. I as a Hill staffer, you always get your calls answered, right? People always call you back because, of course, they're trying to influence you to get your boss to vote a certain way. And so being on the other side of that and asking staffers to call me back and getting them information and trying to make sure they looked at it when there's like all this information they're getting on all these other matters, it was definitely an exciting challenge. And it paid to be humble, really, and to put in your dues and build those relationships, because it's building those relationships that allows progress to be made. We talk about at times change moves at the speed of trust. And so you have to build a relationship of trust, whether it's the staffers, with the legislator or the member, making sure that you're talking to the schedulers very respectfully, because they're the ones at the end of the day who are putting you on the calendar, to build those relationships across the staff levels, and including the member, of course, that help build a relationship, can move your policies forward. So that was something that I learned early on, and certainly even as a staffer, the people that you like are the ones that treat you respectfully and don't think of you as a 20-something-year-old kid who doesn't know what they're talking about. And I'm not saying that I knew what I was talking about, because I was a 20-something kid who probably didn't know a lot about what I was talking about, but I didn't need someone to have an attitude about it to me, so that was a big thing for me. And then I was in regulatory affairs for a long time. I actually shifted from government affairs to regulatory affairs once I moved to my first electric utility. And I worked in environmental permitting and environmental regulation and proceedings at the Public Utilities Commission, et cetera. And something that I really enjoyed doing. Sometimes politics in the government sphere can be tough and it can be exhausting. In regulatory affairs, there is less politics. It's still there, of course, but I think oftentimes in the regulatory space, you put the best case forward. You have your data, your science, your facts, and it helps more with prevailing at the end of the day in a proceeding. And as many of you know, when it comes down to politics or policy, politics often wins. And we kind of heard the Congresswoman just now, like on gun control, right? Just common sense measures that many people support, and we still can't get those. And that's politics of a situation, not the policies that the public supports, and you've got a lot of members that support it too. So it was a nice sort of break, I think, from the government affairs space for a little bit. And there's obviously a lot of linkage, because many of the regulators are appointed by your governor and then approved by the Senate. So that was something that I dealt with when I was in North Carolina, and something that even when I moved here to California, to Southern California, Edison 10 years ago, in the regulatory space, worked a lot with the government affairs team, because we wanted to make sure we had good people nominated to these different bodies that were important to the company. And so let's name some people, and let's make sure that some of these people are from Southern California, please, because they know the difference between what's happening in Southern California and Northern California. And so it was, but coming back into government affairs or public affairs, or I guess we call it corporate affairs, because it's not just the government affairs, but it's communications and the philanthropy as well. Was a nice sort of welcoming back to, again, like I said, full circle from where I started many years ago. So.
Yeah, I think it's just so interesting to me to also hear all the different ways, not just working hard, but I'm hearing also about relationship building, about really showing up, getting something done and done well, but that over time, like how that plays out in this space, and really what is possible in terms of change is also related to all of it. And so it's really interesting to hear how it played out in your career. And I'd love to hear too, like, there's a lot of folks here who are interested in not just running for office, but are very interested in policy. And so what do you see as the future of government affairs, and what advice would you have to someone who's interested in joining this field?
Well, I think that the government affairs sphere is growing, honestly, because there's so many aspects now of business that really need government affairs, and some companies who may not have ever had a government affairs function are looking to add that to their to their teams now. And I think diversity in government affairs is super important. You look around, especially in California, but nationally too, and not just the AAPI community that's growing, but you see these efforts of many businesses to push diversity within their business strategies. I mean, it's certainly something that at Edison we're doing. And so I do think that having a government affairs team that has not just gender diversity, which is really important, but also ethnic and racial diversity, I see that continuing to expand in government affairs. And so I think the Cause Leadership program and this, the Leadership Institute, is a really important way to both build the skills, but also build a network of people who are going into government affairs. And one of the things that I'm sure you've seen, Nancy, and you're an example of it, because a little over a year ago, you weren't at cause. So people do move around in the government affairs space, and building those networks along the way of where you have been and then where you go next. It like I said, it just creates a web of relationships that you have, and that helps build not just a career, but helps build a career of others, right? Because I think one of the things that I enjoy doing is connecting people that I know and where I think that they can help one another, not just from a professional development perspective, but actual, professional work that that a business deal could get done between two people's companies by making that connection. And so I think spending time on building those relationships or maintaining the relationships that you have, because I don't think it's necessarily you have to have a huge network, but having a few key ones, I think does make a difference. And checking in on people, because people don't like to be called for a request when you haven't kept in touch with how they're doing, So I think it's really important just to check on people and how they're doing, and maintaining that relationship, even as a touch point, just once a year, just checking in, see how their families are, see, oh, the kids are in college now, or things like that. I mean, time does fly, honestly. And it amazes me actually when I check in on some of my friends, much less colleagues in the government affairs field, how much change has occurred in just a short period of time. And certainly over the last 2 years plus here with COVID-19, people have had some immense changes in their lives as a result of not just the pandemic, but what it's done to businesses and what it's done to families. And so having that check-in, I think, is super important. So yeah, I think government affairs is just a growing field, and some of these companies that are just startups now, they even recognize that the role of government in their success, in their business success, is such that it's important to have a government affairs function to help them navigate with government on the importance of whatever tax policy or health policy or whatever it may be in order for them to be successful. So I just see it being a real growth sector, continue to be a growth sector going forward.
Oh, it is. It's so interesting to see all the different layers of it, but also I think to your point around catching up, touching base with each other too. Like I've been surprised at who I continue to run into since I've been here at Cause, and just remembering our community actually is very connected and small. And sometimes those catch-ups really end up resulting in pretty amazing collaborations. And so
Yeah.
I really have appreciated that too. I see a question in the chat that I'm going to ask, but that's a warning to the fellows that if you have a question, definitely think it through, flag it, and we'll ask it next. So the question is, what are you personally looking forward to most about the future of API leadership at SCE in California and in the country?
Wow. Well, I'll start with at SCE. When I got to Southern California Edison 10 years ago, I was the first female officer at the company, which is pretty amazing because at the time we were 125 years old. And so it took 125 years for us to have an Asian officer. Not that we didn't have Asian executives before that, but it was sort of like, wow. And the guy who was the first Asian officer at the company, he had just gotten there only a few years before me. So let's just say at 120. So let's just say it took 120 years to get the first Asian officer ever at the company. But since that time, we've made up for lost time, I'm very glad to say. And so it's been really nice to see the growth of representation of APIs at Southern California Edison at the executive and senior executive ranks. And so I'm a senior vice president at both the holding company and the utility. And Eric Takiesu, who many of you know, became a senior vice president earlier this month, I can't remember when, but just a couple of weeks ago, we promoted him to senior vice president. We have, I think, 5 officers now that are Asian or APIs, and a number of directors. So it's really been an incredible rise, I think, of APIs at Edison. And I see that continuing. So I'm very pleased to see it. We've worked hard as an enterprise to focus on both gender parity. We're looking forward to, we're trying to get gender parity across the company. Actually, at the executive managing committee, we do have gender parity at 50-50. And at SCE, we actually have more women. Well, now Eric's there. We might be at gender parity. We're outnumbering the men, but now that Eric's there, I think we might be 50-50. And working on the racial and ethnic diversity as well. So it's been really wonderful to see. AAPIs, as you all know, fastest growing population in California. So absolutely see more AAPIs being represented in government, starting at the local level, which we are seeing a lot of growth of APIs at the local level. And that's the feeder pool for state and for federal representation. And so I do think that, at least in California, having institutes like this that Edison's so proud to support is a step, because it helps provide that awareness of like, oh, I could represent my community. And starting, I don't know, at the school board. Well, I don't know, school boards have gotten so political. Maybe start in the planning commission. I don't know, they're all political now. But in any case, starting at a local level, at something that's even below the city council level, just to get your feet wet to see if you like it, because it is a lot of work. There's a lot of, I decided when I was a staffer, I could never be an elected official because I really dislike the town hall meetings, not from the questions, but like you got the, you'd have a town hall on healthcare, because healthcare was really big when I was on the Hill. And so you'd have 10 town halls across the district on healthcare. And by the third one, I was so bored because it was like the same questions that have been asked in the first 2. And I was like, oh my gosh, and you have to pretend that it's such a great, and it is a great question. It's just the 3rd time I've heard it. And by the 10th time I've heard it, it's really, not as interesting. So I was just like, I cannot fake that nearly as well as you need to fake it to be an elected official. Even though they're very good questions, it's very hard for me after the 10th time being like, that's a great question, and being as enthusiastic about it as the first time that I heard it. So I just realized that was definitely not for me. I couldn't do the campaigning part of political office, and probably the fundraising part either, to be fair. But in any case, I would say I do see just great opportunities for the Asian Pacific Islander population, not just because of the growth of the population, but I think the growing awareness of APIs in civic engagement. And Cause led the way in that. I mean, folks like Charlie really have dedicated so much of their time and their resources to bringing that awareness to the API community, because traditionally I would say we just put our heads down and work and not even think so much about how do we engage in the political process. And organizations like Cause are so important to really bring that awareness to generations like you all, in order to get you to move into that direction, whether it's on the private sector side like myself or in the public side. So I'm very optimistic.
I'm glad to hear it, because I think that that's important, and I think I'm glad you mentioned Charlie as well. I think he wasn't able to make it today, but I know he's excited to see this recording, so he'll be excited to hear himself name. But I also feel like he's just been such a great leader, as well as our other leaders here today too. So
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna invite Howie to ask his question, and then we'll wrap up your segment. But yeah, Howie, go ahead, turn on your camera.
Hello, thank you for speaking first off. My question is this. I'm generally environmentally conscientious, I want to shift towards renewables, more electricity and whatnot. The 2 big ones in my mind is getting EV cars or putting up solar panels, except those are contingent on me having a house. And so like me and many of my peers struggle with buying a house in SoCal because it's expensive. So is there any initiatives, policy, anything else that I can support that's more than just like being mindful of my lights?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really great question. So, so for those who rent, it is definitely more difficult for programs like ours and other utilities because they are geared to, as you noted, homeowners. Now, we do have a program for multi-unit dwellings, we call apartment buildings, multi-unit dwellings, MUDs. That is intended to put solar on multi-unit dwellings so that the building occupants would be the beneficiaries of that. So your building management company could participate in that program, and it's actually targeted it's targeted towards our underserved communities, which we have a lot of in Southern California, as you know, disadvantaged communities per the Cal Enviro screen. So that's a potential one. The state has maybe other programs that would be helpful to renters for solar, but that is definitely a difficult one because you don't own your roof. Cars, it's a little bit easier because you can get a lease or you can buy even though you don't own your home. The charging is where may be difficult. And so one of the things we're working on, we have a program called Charge Ready that is putting chargers in places that are publicly accessible. And so we're trying to get about 50,000 chargers across our service area to help with vehicle adoption, and particularly for places that that are not none of the program isn't targeted to homeowners. It's targeted to places that will have public access, and it's targeted to multi-unit dwellings, because when we did the pilot, one of the things they found out was that in multi-unit dwellings, you had the building owner and you had the building management, and they were not the same, right? So the building owner hires the building management company. Neither one wanted to necessarily take responsibility for chargers. The building owner was like, well, I got the building management company. The building management company's like, well, I only have the contract for X number of years, so I'm not sure. And so one of the things that we have in our charge rate program is an option for the utility to own and operate the charger. So now the building owner, the building management company can agree that, okay, yes, we want chargers in our building. Edison, you come in, you own and operate. We don't have to deal with if it breaks down. You are the one who's going to get the charger fixed and that kind of thing. So that is something that we are also working on, not just publicly accessible charging, but charging in multi-unit dwellings so that people who can have access to EV charging there too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. I think I love listening to you talk about what you're passionate about. And also I've heard so many things about how fun it is to be on the Edison team. And so it's really great to hear it. But yeah, thank you for being here, for being part of our Creating Our Paths and Women in Power. So
thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. All right, everyone. Now to close out our event, Michigan State Senator, the Honorable Stephanie Chang, will have a candid conversation with Diana Hwang, founder and co-executive director of the Asian American Women's Political Initiative. Senator Stephanie Chang is the first Asian American woman to be elected to the Michigan legislature and worked as a community organizer in Detroit for nearly a decade before serving 2 terms in the Michigan House of Representatives. We pre-recorded this interview because it's pretty late on the East Coast, but we definitely wanted to include them. And so we're going to share that with you right now, and then come back for some closing remarks. So.
Thank you, Nancy. As Nancy said, I'm the founder of the Asian American Women's Political Initiative, AAWPI, the country's only political leadership organization for AAPI women. And when I started it, a number of people in this community asked me, why just women? And so the conversations we're having here, this is why. So thank you to Justine, thank you to Steve, Talia, Farah, and Nancy for your leadership in pulling this together. And I just want to say how honored I am to be with you. With these incredible panelists in this incredible space that has created for us to talk about AAPI women in politics, AAPI women in leadership, and AAPI women in power. And particularly honored to be in conversation with you, State Senator Chang. I wanted to just get right into it. Could you just tell us a little bit about your story and your why you do the work?
Thank you so much, Cause, for inviting us to be part of this event. Exciting to be here. And thank you, Diana. So my name is Stephanie Chang. I am a daughter of Taiwanese American immigrants who came to this country looking for a better opportunity. I'm a mom of 2 little kids, 2 young daughters. I'm also a former community organizer. So before I ran for office, I worked for nonprofits doing organizing work around everything from affirmative action to criminal justice reform to voting rights and comprehensive immigration reform, and actually co-founded an Asian American civic engagement group in Michigan. And while I was in graduate school, I was encouraged to run for the state house. And so that was back in 2014. And it's been a whirlwind since. In 2014, I became the first Asian American woman elected to the Michigan legislature. And then since then, moved over from the House to the state Senate, where I also became the first woman senator to give birth while serving in the Senate, in the state Senate. So, and as far as my why, honestly, right now, my 2 young daughters are my little motivators. And, our country is just in such an important time in history right now. And, I just, oh my gosh, but I really think a lot about, the future that I want for them and what they deserve. And so they are my little motivators that keep me going.
Thank you. So you talk about, they say that women, they don't have necessarily stats for Asian American, but women have to be asked at least 7 times before they have to run, right? And I ran for Massachusetts State Senate, and it was one of the most incredible experiences in my life, but it was scary, right? And so can you talk about sort of your decision and how you came to that decision to run?
Yeah. So, when I got approached, so I was approached by my then state representative, Rashida Tlaib, who's now a member of Congress. She was my friend. She was my state rep at the time. She was entering her last term in the state house because we have term limits in Michigan. And I'll be honest, like when she first asked me to run, I did not think she was serious. I pretty much laughed her off. And so that happened a couple times until later on. She's like, no, we need to have a serious
conversation. Happened a couple of times, Stephanie. Is that what you're saying? It happened a couple of times. Okay. Yeah. I thought she just kept making the same joke over and over again.
I mean, I don't know. It just wasn't sinking in. But then finally, we started having conversations about it, and I said I would think about it. And so over the course of 6 months, I had a lot of conversations with people about it. I shadowed her at the Capitol. I went back and forth between yes and no, a whole bunch of times. I had a lot of self-doubt about whether or not I was the right person, if I was old enough, if I had enough experience, if I knew enough about the issues. And then eventually I just realized, of course I should do this. This is a way to make a difference for the community that I love in an even bigger way and make a difference. So, and because I come from this organizing background, it kind of actually made a lot of sense in a way. So, and actually I remember someone saying, I'll continue to be an organizer. I'll just be organizing my colleagues and organizing community to push legislation. So, it really, that really helped to frame it for me as okay, this is something that I can do. So it did take me a good 6 months to make that decision, and a lot of self-reflection, a lot of conversations, but truly, grateful, because I think without that encouragement, especially from other women and women of color in particular, I wouldn't be here.
And look, I think part of the reason why we have this space and these spaces and are having this kind of panel is because, the theme of it is creating your own path. And so much, even just in your intro, you're like, the number of times you could say first, right? Because you were the first in so many spaces. Even when you ran again, you were the first again, right? So that is definitely, it doesn't feel like there's a lot. Doesn't feel like there's a game plan that is the same for us, right? That other people follow. So I guess what is your advice then to someone thinking about it as well, who's been asked, maybe thought it was a joke. And, you know, like, what is your advice to them as they look at this big, scary thing? There's still very few, right? 1% of state legislators are AAPI women. We would literally need almost 4 times as many to have equal representation. So you're blazing a trail, but there's still so much more to go. So what do you say to the next generation of trailblazers?
Yeah, well, you know, for me, I kind of, this is what I tell a lot of women and women of color in particular, is to really think about, like, for so many of us who were already leading, who are already public servants in a way, already making change in the community. Public service and running for office is kind of an extension of that. And so I really try to remind people to look at what they've already done and recognizing the incredible skills and experiences that so many Asian American women already have had, and how valuable that is to bring to a state legislature or a city council or a school board or to Congress. You know, we have an important voice. And I also think, you know, with looking especially at this past couple of years, over this pandemic and this, you know, obviously this pandemic, in addition, you know, this huge rise in anti-Asian hate, and just a reckoning around racial justice in our country that is ongoing. But our voices are so important. And I think about the fact that literally, if I wasn't there, and if, you know, Padma Kupa, who was the second Asian American woman in the Michigan legislature, if we weren't there, who would have been doing the things that we were doing? To organize a press conference around, you know, making sure that people know, here's the hate crimes unit at the Attorney General's office calling Dana Nessel, our Attorney General, and saying, will you do this with us? Organizing town halls with the community, and providing information and being that link to state government, you know, doing the resolutions to condemn anti-Asian hate. You know, I actually don't know who would have been doing that. And so we play an important role, but also so many of us already had those skills and that leadership experience, even if you didn't even see yourself as a leader. If people are recognizing it and asking you to run, it's because they're recognizing that you are already leading in the community. And so this is an extension of that, and running for office is an incredible way to make a difference for the community that you love.
That's amazing. And, you know, I think one of the things that I realized when I was working at the State House is, you know, I'm in Massachusetts, and I started as a baby aide. That's what I call it, as baby aide. That's my first job out of college. And like, I just started recognizing that in these halls of power, we were completely invisible. And that was really reflected, as you said, in policy, right? So there was a whole year. And when I started the State House, there were in Massachusetts, which now, thank God, we have like Michelle Wu and these incredible leaders. But back then we had 200 legislators, 0 Asian American legislators. I was one of the only staffers. And I remember a whole year when they did mental health legislation and there were no Asian Americans at the table, right? And we know that that affects our community, particularly now. You're touching upon anti-Asian hate. And I think a lot of people think it's over, right? Like it didn't happen. I mean, I want to touch upon the fact that like just this week, right? We had, we're filming this in California, you know, for an audience, primarily people in California. There was a church shooting, right? Like places of worship. Again, there was a Dallas shooting of Korean women, right? Like at a hair salon, like places that are supposed to be sacred, for lack of a better word, where we're supposed to feel safe, right? But anti-Asian hate continues. And so why is it so important? I think you've already touched on it. For someone like you, right, who is very connected to community and understands that it continues while it fades away for a lot of people, right? The impact you're able to have, but also, you know, what can people who are watching do who may not want to run for office, right? But like, how do you have an impact in this moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple things. You know, one, I kind of feel like it is super important to have Asian American representation, not just for the numbers, but again, it's like you said, to shape policy and also to be a link, right? Like I think that for so many Asian American community members, having someone that they know, like, okay, that person, I can call them and they will understand what's going on because they're Asian American too. And I just remember after the Atlanta shooting, a number of parents and professors and other people reaching out to say, why are our kids not learning Asian American history in schools? I was like, you're right. So then we worked with them and, put together a bill very similar to the Illinois Teach Act, and modeled after, so, but, to be that point of contact where people feel comfortable because there is that feeling of representation to reach out and to say, this is what we need. So I think that is super important. Obviously, I mean, people have their own representation, even if I'm not their state senator, that's fine. I'm here to serve and like partner up with other legislators too. And the sort of funny, well, I don't know, funny, but it's kind of like the weird thing about this. Actually, I represent a district that doesn't actually even have that many Asian Americans, but people still know that I'm there, right? And so I serve my district, but I also know that I have a huge responsibility of being the first Asian American woman in the legislature.
You make them feel seen. You make them feel comfortable. Yeah, please go ahead.
I definitely know that. And I know that because people have said it. And I also know it because people have like gotten involved either, on my campaigns or in my legislative office as interns where they might not have had those experiences if not for, me deciding to run. So I think that's really impactful. And, for people who are watching and feeling, it is a tough time right now, right? Like our country has been through a lot. Over obviously like a long time, but especially over the past couple of years, it's been a lot to deal with. And I think, sometimes it can feel really hopeless. But I think that we've got to remember, so for me, like part of what drives me is in addition to being a mom of these two young daughters who are amazing, one of them's walking around in the back here, and also, being a daughter of immigrants who came to this country believing in opportunity, like we have these values of opportunity and equity and access and justice. Those are things that are so worth fighting for. And so I know it can be really hard, but we've got to keep going because our future, our children are depending on us. And so we've got to just keep fighting for what they deserve. And I also feel a real sense of optimism because there has been such a surge in activism, just, you name it, from Black Lives Matter and all of the protests around police accountability to Asian Americans coming together after the spa shootings last year, to now, attacks on reproductive freedom that have been, decades in the making. But, that there's all these people who are feeling fired up and feeling engaged. And so on those days when it feels really hopeless, to remember to look around and realize we are not alone. We are actually on the right side of history, and that we are going to win because we just have this huge, momentum that may not always feel like it's there, but it is there, and we are going to keep just moving forward. And we need to achieve the goal, the vision of our country that, so many of our parents or our grandparents, came here believing in.
Okay, well, I don't know if there's a better way to end than that, like with a pep talk from State Senator Stephanie Chang. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for inspiring us with your words and, for giving us hope. It's a really hard time right now, right? But I think we are in a righteous fight, right? To be seen, to be heard, to have our voices heard. And we just are so grateful for your leadership, Senator Chang.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Wow. Thank you to all of our speakers today. I actually know for me, just hearing State Senator Chang and Diana also just shortly after, they had recorded last week, and I know there's just been a lot that's happened over the weekend. And so our thoughts go out to the families of the community and the communities that have been impacted by all the violence these last few days. And I say that because I feel like there's also this opportunity to be part of these conversations around change, to get involved in different ways, whether it's by running for office, by being involved in advocating to your elected officials, or for your roles in private sector or nonprofit. And so I think that's a lot of the focus for us here with the Cause Leadership Institute. Thank you to our board members. I know I see Hwang here, and I know Tammy Tran is here as well. But thank you to all of our board members, some of whom couldn't be here today. The Cause Leadership Institute Fellows from 2022, as well as the Cause team who helped make this possible: Steve Lynn, Justine Ventura Mejia, and Talia Campos, and Farah Sue. And also, just to save the date for our upcoming program graduation, it's going to be on Wednesday, June 22 from 7 to 8 o'clock. And so this program will be ending on June 22nd, and we'll be looking forward to celebrating with our fellows, but also just there's so many ways to get involved. Don't forget to turn in your ballot by June 7th. And thank you so much for coming and being part of this conversation today.